Tonight on preseason news, injuries galore, depth chart craziness, coach speak, and the latest installment of the Brandon Aiyuk saga. Plus, the reason you're really here. What does this mean for your fantasy football team? All this and more on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. The preseason's finally arrived, so we've got heaps of preseason news to take you through. I'll be talking about all the fantasy implications and taking you through what I think of this news and whether it's something you should really worry about. If you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. I'll be doing this every week, plus bringing out a heap of other awesome fantasy football content. You can also hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, doing a heap of competitions over there at the moment, where you get a chance to play with us in the FFD League. It's the third year of doing that, and I hope you'll consider going over there and giving it a shot at getting in. You can also find me on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. That's where I announce most of my stuff. My articles are over at football.rasball.com, and you can find all of my rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Let's get into the news for this week. As usual, we'll be doing it with this format. So I'll take you through the news, and then I'll take you through the fantasy implications. The rankings down there are firstly my redraft ranking, and then my dynasty ranking. The arrow obviously gives you an indication of what direction I think this player is taking after hearing this news. And the first news we have, well, it ain't good. Justin Herbert has plantar fascia and is week to week. And I've had this, and it is not fun to play sport with. So it is hoped he'll be back for week one, but depending on how serious it is, this could be a thing that affects him longer term and could have a real impact on his season. It's not the kind of thing that just immediately goes away. So hopefully he's lucky and he's able to play through it and it doesn't create an issue, but this is going to have an impact on him. I have moved him down in redraft. It doesn't really affect him too much in dynasty for me. I was already pretty low on him on both counts because this offense is going to be a little bit of a mess passing wise. So I do think he's going to struggle anyway, but this is just even worse news for him. So look, if you're getting Justin Herbert in leagues, you're taking a pretty big risk if you're not getting him very late in drafts. Meanwhile, the Broncos have listed Jarrett Stidham as their starter for week one of the preseason. And that's not because Bo Nix isn't playing. No, Bo Nix is listed as the QB3, and that's also reflected in their depth chart. But you've got to take these things with a big grain of salt. We know that Sean Payton's pretty old school. He does like to make the rookies earn it, even though he will talk them up. He has talked a lot about depth chart competition, but he's got Audric Estime, RB5, behind Tyler Beatty. We know that's not going to be how it ends up. He's also got Tim Patrick as a starter, while he's got Troy Franklin as the wide receiver 11. So you've got to take these depth charts with a large grain of salt. We'll see what happens in the second and third weeks of the preseason. Having said that, this is still bad news. You don't want a situation where a guy that you're hoping will start is not starting the first week of the preseason. That firstly means he's not going to get the reps that he should be getting. And secondly, it is a sign that potentially Jarrett Stidham might be the starter to start the season. I think that is possible. I still think Bo Nix is the favorite, but the fact that this is happening is legitimately bad news for Nix. This is not one of those situations where it's like, we'll move him down a little bit or we'll just kind of be uncomfortable with it. No, this is a legit, I'm moving them quite a bit closer because this is a proper sign that Stidham is still at least being used as the starter. It wouldn't surprise me if by next week Nix is the starter or if that happens before the start of the season, but I do think there is a reasonably high chance that Stidham at least starts the season. I don't want either of these guys anyway. This offense is going to be a hot mess, but if you're going to take one of them, and it will presumably, outside dynasty obviously, and it will presumably be in a super flex league, I think Nix is probably still the guy you want, but I'm personally avoiding both. And if you're really desperate for a quarterback in a super flex league, I guess you could reasonably take Stidham. Now, the Steelers quarterback battle could apparently be more of a competition than it initially appeared. This is from Brooke Pryor via ESPN, and not really buying into this. We know Russell Wilson's a little bit banged up at the moment, so Justin Fields is getting opportunities, but we've heard how poor Fields was earlier in the preseason and in the offseason. I don't know that this is really saying much at all. I think Wilson is going to be the starter. Now, will he be the starter for the whole season? Probably not. I do think the Steelers might struggle this year. I think if the Steelers are still in contention, they probably stick with Wilson. But if they have a run of losses or it's starting to look like they're not going to end up in the playoffs, I think they probably give Fields a go just to see what happens and see what they've got in both of these guys. They don't have big money invested in either of these guys, especially not long term. Wilson's the guy that you want in redraft if you're in a super flex league and you're a bit desperate and need a third guy on your bench. But Fields, realistically, he's still got solid long-term value. If he can finally get somewhere and get a starting job, we know how good he is with his legs, and that makes him very valuable for fantasy. So if Fields starts, especially in a super flex league, he's someone that you're going to definitely be interested in, but the chances of him starting anytime soon is pretty low. Now, Gino Smith says he intends to run more in 2024. Now, that's not someone saying that about him. He directly said that. Now, players say stuff all the time, and it doesn't always come true, but this kind of feels like something that may have an impact. I think I slid him up ever so slightly. I think I didn't really have a natural player to move him past in redraft, but I would have if there was a spot. He certainly moved closer to the guy above him at the moment, which I believe is Daniel Jones, but I still think Jones has more upside. So I couldn't actually move Smith up, but I do think this is a positive move for Geno Smith. If you're someone in a super flex league, I think Smith is someone you could reasonably take. If he actually adds some running to his game, that's really going to help him for fantasy. So this is positive. It's just not a guarantee that it's actually going to happen. Now, apparently Mason Rudolph looks poised to win the backup job over Malik Willis. This isn't very big news. I'm not even going to talk about rankings here because no one's got Mason Rudolph in their team. And if you've got Malik Willis, you need to drop him. You don't want either of these guys. The fact that this is even a battle is awkward and uncomfortable. I mean, realistically, we know Will Levis is the starter. He's not going to be very good. If Mason Rudolph comes in, he's not going to be very good. If Malik Willis comes in, there's a big problem. So I don't think you want either of these guys in fantasy. So just drop them both. You probably don't have Rudolph. I doubt anyone has Rudolph outside of very deep league, but Willis is someone you definitely don't need either. Now, let's talk about the running backs. Christian McCaffrey will miss the preseason with a calf injury. Kyle Shanahan said he might miss a couple of weeks. That doesn't mean a couple of weeks of the season. That means a couple of weeks of the preseason. So I do think that we see that by the week or two out from the season, he's fine and ready to go. But there's no point in them starting him. He's a vet. They don't need to play him in those preseason games. Running backs just get injured. So I'm not worried about McCaffrey too much. Having said that, any sort of muscle injury, it's not good news. These things can flare up. These things can take longer to recover, and they can kind of come back during the season. So this might be something that's totally innocuous, or it might be something that's a little bit concerning. I'm not moving McCaffrey in my rankings. He's still my number one in redraft. I'm still taking number one in pretty much every league, depending on your settings, unless it's like a PPR where you're starting 3 wide receivers or something like that. Probably still taking McCaffrey first. In Dynasty, you're still going to be a great asset as well, especially if you win now. But this is a little bit of one of those things you just file away in the back of your head. A lot of people over the internet are going to be using this as an excuse to take a Breece Hall or a Bijan Robinson over McCaffrey. That's getting too cute. That's crazy. You don't need to do that. McCaffrey is still the number one guy in fantasy. There's always a risk of injury with any player. That was the same thing with Breece Hall going into last season. And realistically, that re-injury is always a possibility as well. There are no safe running backs. You've just got to pick your poison and hope that your guy stays healthy. And I'm definitely putting my money in with McCaffrey. Jonathan Brooks, on the other hand, I have no interest in. I've been calling this from a long time out. When I talked to Walt from World of Football, he was shouting from the rooftops, you do not want to take running backs with ACL injuries, especially recent ones. We know he's young, but Brooks realistically is someone that is not going to be very good for most of this season. We're hearing from Dave Canales directly that he'll hopefully be ready by week 3 or 4. Hopefully be ready by week 3 or 4. Are you kidding me? You do not want this guy on your fantasy team. That doesn't mean ready to be the starting running back in Carolina. That means ready to play. I mean, it might even mean ready to train, but I believe it means ready to play. That's terrible news. This is not like the Breece Hall situation where he got a little bit of a slow start. This is a situation where he's not even on the field in week 1. You do not want this guy on your team. Realistically, I wouldn't take him ahead of anyone that's not a backup. He will eventually become a starter, but he's not going to be very explosive initially. I think for the first 9 to 10 weeks, he's going to be pretty much unusable. He might be usable down the stretch, but I still don't think he's going to be someone you can rely on. Why would you use a middle round pick on that? There's just better plays that you can get that have more upside because they're in better offenses. I just don't see why you would want Brooks in your team. So Brooks takes a big drop for me. Chuba Hubbard moves up, but realistically, Brooks is going to be back in week 3 or 4, and then Hubbard's not going to be the starter. It's going to be some sort of a committee, or Hubbard's the starter and Brooks is kind of backing him up initially and he slowly takes over. Either way, Hubbard doesn't particularly get a lot of value out of this. He's the kind of guy you want if you've got a 0 RB draft going on. So if you're in a situation where you've just got no running backs and you need someone, and you're going for guys like Zeke or Rico Dowdle and the Jerome Fords and people like that, I think Hubbard's someone that can get your season started. He's just not someone I want to really be relying on later on in the season. Meanwhile, the Rams are prioritizing keeping Kareem Williams fresh this season. There's a lot of words there, basically. This doesn't mean particularly much to me, honestly. We hear this sort of stuff all the time. We need to actually see how they use him. They said the same thing about Travis Etienne last season, and he ended up as the running back too. I'm not taking this as being particularly significant news. We know why they brought in Blake Corum. He's there to spell Kareem Williams. But Kyron Williams is really good, and they like Kyron Williams a lot. And I do expect that Williams is still going to be a very good fantasy producer. It's like the Jets bringing in Braylon Allen to spell Breece Hall. We're not suddenly saying, well, I can't possibly have Breece Hall in my fantasy team. Breece Hall is really good. They're not going to use Allen for anything but to give him a rest. And the same thing's going to happen here. Corum's a good player, but realistically, Williams is still the very clear starter, and they do like him a lot. They brought in a backup because they like Williams, which sounds a little bit weird, but it is just to keep him healthy. Now, this is a guy I do like. Andy Reid has said that Isaiah Pacheco is good with the protections, he's good with the technique and the fundamentals. Anytime you have a guy who's coming into this sort of offense with a coach like Andy Reid and he's showing he's got good pass protection, that's fantastic news for his fantasy prospects. He's been trusting Jerick McKinnon with this job for a couple of years, and that's been pretty productive. There were years where McKinnon was totally startable in fantasy, despite being just the receiving down back. Now, we know they have a lot wider range of wide receivers now, so it's certainly not like Pacheco is going to be one of the top receivers, but this will keep him out in the field a very high amount. We're talking about Kareem Hunt level. So this is good news for Pacheco. He moves upwards for me. He's a running back one. I do like the idea of getting him in the 3rd round of drafts. I think that's fantastic value. So he's someone that I'm going to have, I think, a lot of shares of. I already do have quite a few shares. I can definitely see the upside here. This is not me being a Chiefs homer. I'm very low on a lot of the other Chiefs players. I do think that we're going to see a lot of Pacheco this season. Now, meanwhile, the Denver backfield is a total mess. Sean Payton has said that Javonte Williams looks like a completely different player, but he also praised Jalil McLaughlin and Audrey Esteem. I don't know that that's really particularly significant news on any of these counts. I think this is Sean Payton just saying stuff. Williams has moved up slightly for me, mainly because, top of the depth chart is positive when you also have Samaje Perine, but Samaje Perine is listed as 2nd ahead of McLaughlin, who we know is actually ahead of him. So we can't read too much into that depth chart. The fact that Payton's at least finally saying positive things about Williams is better than what was happening previously. Williams has eased up slightly for me. It just does seem like the tea leaves are suggesting that long-term Williams is going to be the guy, and that Jalil McLaughlin will have a definite role, but it's going to be more of a change of pace role. I don't know whether Audrey Castan, I don't know whether he's going to take over that role from Perine, if he's going to take over a different role, if he's competing with Williams, if he's going to be involved at all, if he's a special teams player. It's a little bit messy understanding what's going on. I think McLaughlin's definitely going to be involved, but I'm not as confident he's going to be the starter. I'm going to have to look at what Cecil Lammy's saying later on in this preseason to get a better idea of what's happening. And we'll probably get a better idea by probably week 2 of the preseason, assuming they're actually continuing to start their starters. I think week 1 will tell us something too. So we'll see what happens there. They are starting their starters, the Broncos, in their first game, I believe. Now, Braylon Allen has been listed as the running back 2 on the Jets' first official depth chart. Now, I've been high on Braylon Allen all offseason, so this is not surprising. This is just to remind you that I really like Braylon Allen. I do think that if Breece Hall goes down, Braylon Allen takes over that Breece Hall role. It doesn't become a committee. Allen is the guy. I do think they really like Allen there. I think he's got that 3-down skill set. They've been saying a lot of positive things about his receiving work. He's a big back, so he can be used on the goal line. I love it in best ball because I think he's going to steal some of those touches from Breece Hall and is going to have some boom games. But I do think if Hall goes down with an injury, Allen all of a sudden becomes massively valuable. So this is just a reminder that Jets haven't even tried to put him behind Izzy Abanikunda, who's the veteran, relatively. They've just put him straight in there at number 2. They've even put Isaiah Davis ahead of Izzy, I believe. So look, Braylon Allen is the clear number 2. This is a guy you want in case of a Breece Hall injury. He is, to me, one of the top handcuff options. And you should go check out my upside running back video if you're interested in the other guys who are going to take on that role and should be guys that you have on your bench. Now, speaking of backups, this is a bit of a surprise. I've been a little bit nervous about the Packers situation for a while. I'm just not convinced by what they're doing with Marshall and Lloyd. And this is the first person I've really heard come out and say something definitive like this. A.J. Dillon will be the Packers' number 2 back, while Marshall and Lloyd will have a redshirt season. Now, the fact that he said this doesn't mean I believe it. I just think it's interesting because I do think that it's not necessarily going to be quite as clear-cut as we've been talking. Having said that, Matt Schneidman's come in and said Marshall and Lloyd, or as I spelled it, Marshall and Lloyd, is making a run to serve as the number 2 back. The wording there is really interesting because it implies that he's not already the clear number 2 back. I think a lot of people just assumed that. Now, I do think it's reasonable to think that he probably gets there. You can see that I've got Lloyd ranked way higher than Dillon. I do think ultimately this season, for most of the season, Lloyd will be the number 2. But Josh Jacobs is the guy you want here. And I do think if Jacobs goes out, it's not going to be a case of Lloyd taking over and being a clear top back. I do think you see a lot more Dillon than you would prefer. And that kind of lowers the value of Lloyd by quite a bit. I don't think this is going to be the Jones-Dillon committee situation that we've seen in the past. Now, sadly, Tyreek Cohen has retired from the NFL. He's about 29 years old. He's had some serious injuries. Obviously did his ACL and also broke his tibia at the same time, I think. And then tried to come back and then I believe did his Achilles or something like that. It's been a brutal couple of years. Latched on with a practice squad last year. Was apparently hearing some good things about him this year, but he's decided to retire. So all the best to Tyreek Cohen. If you, for some reason, got any shares around the place, you can drop them now. Let's talk wide receivers, and the big wide receiver news continues to be about Brandon Aiyuk. This is a weekly theme. So there was news that came out yesterday, I want to say, that the Browns and Patriots have both agreed to a Brandon Aiyuk trade framework with the 49ers. Doesn't mean a lot, but it at least means that they're in talks. And I think that's significant because I kind of just assumed the 49ers would hold on to Aiyuk this season, but they're at least going through the motions of talking to teams. Now, I've since heard from Adam Schefter just recently that the Patriots have decided not to explore any further trade possibilities. That's within the last 12 hours from when I'm recording this. I'm sure we'll hear more news in the coming days for this. It's interesting that the Patriots have pulled out. They said that it's because they had a lot of good options there. Wouldn't surprise me if it's because Brandon Aiyuk says, I have no interest in going to you. I think that would make sense because Aiyuk does ultimately want to play with the championship team, even though the Patriots, I believe, would have paid him the most money. This is probably bad news for Drake May relative to getting Aiyuk, obviously, but I think it's going to help everybody else. Great for Jalen Polk. We want him moving forward, obviously. But I think the big news here is that this is bad for Brandon Aiyuk. Really hopes that Aiyuk would be the guy that we have this season, and instead, I don't know, maybe it's going to be Ricky Pearsall. Pearsall's dealing with an injury at the moment. That's going to make it messy as well. Is he going to have to fight it out with Juwan Jennings, who they really like there as a blocking back? I think this hurts the 49ers in general. Aiyuk is one of the league's best wide receiver blockers. I think this hurts a lot of people. The people that it does probably help in San Fran, it's probably Christian McCaffrey gets a few more touches, receiving touches. Deebo Samuel certainly benefits. Ricky Pearsall, as you can see, obviously benefits. I know this hasn't happened yet, but I'm kind of sliding him down a little bit because I'll slide him down a whole lot more if he moves. If he decides to go to the Browns, I think that's very weird, and I don't really understand how that fits in. Fantastic news for Deshaun Watson. Hurts Amari Cooper quite a bit. Really hurts Jerry Jeudy. Hurts Cedric Tillman to the point where you can drop him. But I think probably Aiyuk ultimately still stays with the 49ers. I'm just far less confident of that now. Meanwhile, Tyreek Hill is staying with the Dolphins. We knew he was anyway. But he has signed a contract restructure, which I think is fair. He has earned that money. He's been excellent. But the interesting thing is they've added no additional years. If anything, that's probably bad news. I didn't quite want to talk about moving him down potentially. But look, I hoped that potentially when he did a restructure, they might add another year and make it an extension. But he seems pretty set that after this contract is over, he's going to move on, or at least there's a possibility of that, to the point where he's not even willing to sign contracts that go past, 2026. So this is an awkward situation. If you got him in Dynasty, you really need to sell him in the next season or two. Probably not this year if you're competing, but if you're not competing, you want to get him out of there before the news starts to hot up that he maybe won't be around. Now, Puka Nacua is week to week with a knee injury. That's bad news. But Sean McVay says he won't be affected in terms of even that prep, which is a weird way of saying that he's essentially not going to be affected in his preparation for week one. not fully willing to trust this. Coach speak can mean a whole lot of different things, and I'm not really sure that McVay is necessarily going to always tell the truth here. But I do think it's reasonable to expect that Nakul will probably be back for week 1. I haven't moved him anywhere in my rankings. I've kind of just eased him down in my thoughts. He's now someone I'm just slightly less confident in. There are certain situations where I now take players above him, but I'm not particularly nervous about this. Knee injury is not something you particularly want to see, but then again, it's not one of those muscle injuries that's just going to keep recurring during the season. I think he probably just ends up being okay. Now, this is a proper injury. DeAndre Hopkins has a new injury and will likely miss 4 to 6 weeks. I didn't quite get what the injury was, but this is bad. This is bad news for a veteran player who's going to take a while to recover, could then hamper him throughout the season. Kind of moved Calvin Ridley up a little bit, but I think this generally just hurts the whole passing offense. It hurts Will Levis. Maybe we see a little bit more from the running game. Maybe Treylon Burks now gets more involved. I'm not sure. Look, this is bad for Hopkins, though. He's someone already was pretty low on in Dynasty. I think he is fading. Wasn't particularly interested in redraft. I liked him last year in redraft. He was solid when he was healthy, but he is kind of starting to hit that wall. And I think this is another sign of that. Jordan Addison's court hearing has been set for October 7, and he's expected to get a 3-game suspension. That's based on the timing and what happened and the extenuating circumstances. That's still technically speculation, but I think it's probably going to be either a 1-game or a 3-game. 3 games probably the most likely, and that really hurts him this redraft season. He was already hurt by the fact that he doesn't have Kirk Cousins anymore. The fact that Justin Jefferson re-signed technically hurts him for Dynasty because he was pretty effective when Jefferson wasn't playing, but once Jefferson came back, he was certainly the clear number 2. TJ Hawkinson's obviously going to be back at some stage as well, so I do think this probably hurts him quite a bit. He's someone that I'm going to be avoiding in pretty much every league. I liked him coming into last season, but this whole situation's getting bad. Joe Burrow has said that Andre Iosivas is going to have a big year. It's pretty vague. But I do think that there's a lot of buzz coming, and it's kind of building that Iosivas might be the guy that they start with for the Bengals. Walt, that I mentioned earlier from Walter Football, when I was on his show a good month or 2 ago, he was talking up Iosivas as the probable number 3. He's very good with rookies, and he believes that Jermaine Burton's just not going to be able to win that job. He thinks that Iosivas is the guy. I think that's likely, and I also think we're going to see a little bit of Trenton Irwin blocking. For that reason, I've moved Burton down. I've moved Iosivas up a little bit, because this at least is helpful when your quarterback's buzzing a player. He didn't buzz the rookie, he didn't buzz Irwin, he chose to buzz this guy. And just adding to all the buzz we're hearing, I'm starting to find that accumulates to the point where I'm moving Iosivas up a bit, but realistically, I'm avoiding them both. I still think Burton's the more talented player, but the situation's getting pretty awkward. Now, this is an interesting one. Ray McLeod is the team's slot receiver after running ahead of Rondale Moore throughout training camp. Can't say I really saw this coming, so I've also got the formatting a little bit wrong on McLeod's rankings there. Sorry about that. Look, Raymond McLeod started before. He started for the 49ers. Rondale Moore is not exactly a clear-cut star or anything like that. He hadn't really earned a starting job. They brought him in pretty cheap. It wouldn't surprise me still that we end up seeing Moore being the starter, but I kind of believe this. This is not just speculation. This is based on who's actually working with the first team. And I do think that this is probably what we see reflected during the season. So McLeod moves up a little bit for me, actually a reasonable amount, because I didn't have him particularly high. I didn't know where he was on the depth chart. Rondale Moore moves down. I feel like this could be an offense you actually want pieces of, given that Kirk Cousins is running it. They've got a lot of good weapons. The problem is McLeod's going to be competing with a lot of weapons. So you probably will need an injury to one of the receivers before he's going to become truly valuable. But I do think that you could find that he has some boom weeks. I think especially in a deeper best ball league, that's where he's going to have his most value. He's also the receiving back. So if you're, sorry, not the receiving back, he's also the kick returner, I believe. So you'll also see that he might give you some points if you have leagues that really help out with kick returns. Now, another one that surprised me a little bit, Paris Campbell's been injured, which to me isn't particularly big news. But the surprising thing is that Johnny Wilson's been playing with the Eagles' first team, not Anais Smith, who I thought it would be. That's relevant for Dynasty for me. I had Smith higher. I thought that Smith was the better player, and I thought he'd fit in a little bit better. I think thought Wilson would struggle with separation issues a little bit, but it seems like Wilson is going to be the wide receiver 4. And I think when Paris Campbell's the only guy ahead of you, we've seen that can potentially mean you find your way into a starting role. Being the Eagles wide receiver 3 is not particularly valuable, but it's better than nothing. So if you're in a deep dynasty league, maybe Johnny Wilson's a guy you want to take a pot shot on if you have itchy fingers and nothing else on your bench. If you're benching like random second kickers and DSTs and stuff like that, I'd rather have Johnny Wilson than that, for example. Now, this is one I'm not particularly happy about. Jonathan Mingo has been listed ahead of Xavier Leggett, which is apparently how he says his own name, according to his Instagram, on the first official Panthers depth chart. Now, we've talked about official depth charts earlier when I talked about the Broncos. I don't think this necessarily means a lot. We do see a lot of depth charts where they'll put the rookies lower. I don't really think that Mingo's going to take over that role, but this is at least a positive sign that Mingo's clearly ahead of Terrace Marshall, for example, who I think he could have easily been listed next to or behind. So it's good that Mingo is the clear number 4 guy. Would have been nice if it was even higher. And it's not impossible that Mingo is the starter and it's actually Leggett coming in for Thielen, for example. So Xavier Leggett goes down a little bit. Jonathan Mingo moves up a reasonable amount, but not to the point where I'd actually want him on my team. Meanwhile, Romeo Dobbs is leading first team snaps from Christian Watson, then Jaden Reed. That's from the Acme Packing Company, is one of the Packers fan sites, and they did some logging at a fan practice recently. And apparently Dobbs logged something like 21 snaps, just ahead of Christian Watson. Jalen Reed had about 16 snaps, and then Wicks had 6. Melton had 3, and Turo, I want to say, had 2 or something like that. I'm doing that off the top of my head, so you can check if it's right or wrong yourself. This is significant because it means that clearly they see Dobbs running as one of the starting outside wide receivers. That's about the snap counts we were seeing last year. That hasn't changed much. We saw Reed being used a lot in the slot, but they would bring Wicks in occasionally for him. For me, this hurts Reed a little bit because I was hoping that Reed would turn into an every down player, and that would have given him a lot of upside. As it is, it's kind of going to be Dobbs and Wicks just kind of doing what we expected. Actually, I like what I expected because I thought Dobbs is going to be starting ahead of Wicks. I know that Wicks is a real fantasy darling this offseason. I think you're going to find that you're dropping him by week 2. He's not someone I'd be going out of my way to get. I think he is still the clear backup. He's going to have some big plays, and he's probably useful in best ball, but he's not someone I'd want in most leagues outside a deeper dynasty league. And I do think that Dobbs could provide some value this season, but I already thought that anyway. Meanwhile, Alex Pierce has, and this is a quote, looked like a key cog in the Colts offense, while the rookie Adonai Mitchell has not been the same playmaker he was during the spring. Now, to be fair, Mitchell looked pretty darn good during the spring, and we know that he can be a little bit hot and cold. This is still not really moving the dial for me. This feels more like just speculation, someone watching stuff and just kind of saying what they see. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily what the coaches are saying. I've still got Mitchell in roughly the same spot. I've still got Pierce in roughly the same spot. If we continue to hear negative Mitchell news, I might move him down a little bit. But Alec Pierce isn't someone I particularly want. He hasn't been impressive in the times that we've seen him, and he's clearly moved down the depth chart. I'm not interested. Jalin McMillan has meanwhile done everything he could be to become the wide receiver 3, and is expected to play a lot as a rookie. That's from Greg Oman. But a direct quote from Todd Bowles is that he said that McMillan is having a great camp. I mean, that's fine. I guess that doesn't necessarily mean where his role is going to be. I've eased McMillan up a little bit. I am kind of coming around to the idea that McMillan is probably going to be the starter. I don't know that you really want the wide receiver 3 here. I think that they're really going to run this offense through Evans, Godwin, White, and a little bit of Odden. I don't think McMillan kind of fits into that. We saw how they used Trey Palmer last year. It wasn't exactly particularly exciting. So I do think that McMillan will probably take that 3rd role, but is it a role you particularly want? I mean, we saw from Palmer, not really. Zach Taylor has called Mike Gesicki a great receiving mismatch as we head into the tight end news. Dan Graziano has also suggested he could be the de facto number 3 receiver. I don't know what he's saying about that whole Bengals wide receiver situation we talked about earlier, but I could see this happening. I think it's probably more likely that we see that committee situation as Eric All gets healthier. We see a whole lot more of All. Wouldn't surprise me if we see a little bit of Hudson as well. This was a big mess last year. Could well stay a mess here, but there's at least upside. I have moved Gesicki up because we are starting to hear a lot more buzz about him, and that suggests he could well end up being the starter. But I want to see a little bit more before I actually go out of my way to get him in fantasy teams. For me, he's still one of those tight ends that you're probably taking at the very end of your bench as an upside guy if you're in a league where for some reason you're taking a whole lot of tight ends. And kicker news, finally. More kicker news. It's Harrison Buka signing a 4-year, $25.6 million contract extension after it was the Browns signing up their kicker last week. This time it is the Chiefs. And this is absolutely insignificant to me from a fantasy perspective. We already knew Buka was going to be their starter. I don't care how many years he's the starter for. My redraft kicker rankings are always identical to my dynasty kicker rankings because I'm really only using a kicker up until the next bye week. So I don't care what's happening in a couple of years' time. The only situation where this really matters, if you're in a league where you are keeping players for extended periods of time with contracts of some sort. I'm in a couple of those leagues, or alternatively, if you're in a really deep, like 32-team league or something like that, then obviously kickers massively increase in value there as well, and you do want that security. Other than that, I mean, Butker's going to be good this season. I think he is one of the more accurate kickers, and we know they do have years where the Chiefs are a good team to have kickers for. But with all kicker situations, realistically, a couple of weeks into the season, you're going to have a totally different kicker in a lot of situations. So you should be taking them in the last round. I'm not going to comment on any other Harrison Butker stuff. Finally, you've got drafts coming up. I would like to help you. Here's how I'm going to do it. Every league is different. The internet does not know anything about your fantasy league. They don't know how many wide receivers you start. They don't know how many points you get for a passing touchdown. They don't know anything about your league at all. They don't even know whether it's PPR or half PPR. Their settings are set up very generically for just random settings. If you're going through anyone on Fantasy Pros, we don't even rank across positions most of the time. Realistically, most rankings out there, especially cross position, are not for you. Sure, you can find out which wide receiver is better than which other wide receiver, but when you take a wide receiver, when you take a running back, when you take a quarterback, that's where I can help you out because it does depend on your league settings. For a very low fee, I can personalize rankings to your specific league settings. It's very simple. All you need to do is email me at benwasley23@gmail.com. Not locked into anything. Feel free just to reach out and ask questions. I'm happy to explain how it works. I would love to help you win your leagues. And that's all we've got for today's preseason news. Quite a bit of news hotting up across the NFL. If you haven't already, I'd love it if you liked and subscribed. That's really helping us grow and get our content out there. You can also check me out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. I answer all of your questions over there. On Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. That's where I do a lot of my announcements. My articles are out at football.rasball.com. They've also got a heap of great tools over there that you should definitely check out. I'm also drafting the Rasball as well over there. So the Rasball is very cool. Looking forward to seeing how that goes. And finally, you should obviously check out my rankings for your drafts at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Just remember, it's more important for you to understand with your league which players you should be taking then, and I'm happy to help you out with my personalized rankings if that's something that interests you. I look forward to seeing you in the coming days when I'll be talking about running backs and what we should expect from this year's rookies. I will see you then.